Hey everybody, and welcome to this episode of Financial Transformation Live. As usual, hi everyone, my name is Hannah Munro, and I'm here to talk to you today about how to map out your finance integration project. Now, as always, I do want this to be an interactive session. So first of all, if you're joining us live, please say hello in the chat, let me know you're there, introduce yourself to the rest of the team that are listening. And of course, a big thank you, as always, to my amazing team, Team ITAS, that are in the background leaving comments. So they'll pop on and say hi as well. So in today's session, we are going to cover, and I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. Today's session, we're going to do a quick recap on our last Financial Transformation Live, or the last one we did on integration, just to be clear, about the options for integration. I'm going to very much focus on, like, once you've decided on your options for integration, what do you need to think about before you actually start going away and building and getting quotes for the integration. I'm going to take you through some examples of documentation that you should be producing. And, it's a quite a detailed list. So don't, I will talk to you about the, when and where each one is appropriate as we go through. And of course, the floor is open for questions. So please do ask questions in the chat. If you're feeling a little bit shy, of whatever reason I don't cover the elements that you need to, then please do DM me. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can send me an email, hannah.munro@itassolutions.co.uk. And we will go through it. And I'll either pick it up in a follow-up session, or I will answer directly as well. So please do reach out if you've got any questions. And as always, feedback is really, really welcome, because I've been doing these for almost 12 months, I think now. So just to introduce myself, we do have a few first-time viewers, which is fabulous. Welcome. My name is Hannah Munro. I am Managing Director, but I'm Transformation Lead at ITAS. So all of the things I talk about today come from being involved for over 10 years in finance transformation. I've always worked in ERP. And actually, one of the biggest challenges is people tend to sit on one side of the fence. They're either in finance or accounting, or they're in technology. And actually, I see myself as being one of the people that sits in the bridge, in the gap between the two. So I'm going to share some learning specifically around designing your sort of data strategy around integration project. If you are not quite at that stage where you're thinking about it, or you're just at the I'm thinking about integration stage, please do go look at one of our on-demand sessions that I did a few months back on integrating your finance systems. We talk about the why, we talk about the different types of integrations, and get into a lot more detail. So if you're still at the conceptual stage, rather than the planning of an integration stage, then I definitely watch that one. But, feel free to join us and stay with us for this session as well. So just to recap, hopefully for those of you that attended will remember, but just to bring us all up to speed. So there are kind of four main options for integrating your finance systems. So the first one is manually via Excel. So what do I mean by that? Is getting exports from one system and importing into the other. The second option is point-to-point API style integration. So that is where you get two APIs and they share data across in either batch or real time without any manual intervention, without anything sitting in the middle. The third option is RPA, or robotic process automation. I've heard BPA, business process automation, or basically it's a piece of middleware that sits in between two bits of software and enables the transformation of data and the sharing of data between two systems. And again, depending on the back end of that system, it can connect into the system directly via SQL databases, or it can do it via the API as well. So that's what we mean by middleware. And then the fourth option, which is still unfortunately quite rare, and is pre-built connectors. So that is where one side or the other, so either the finance system or the system you're trying to integrate with, has a pre-built connection to that product. Now, with this, the one piece I will say is that people will say they have pre-built connectors, and actually what they mean is they can produce a file in the export and import format. So I've seen a lot of pre-built connectors, pretending to be option number 1, which is manual via Excel. So just, with that option, you just really need to make sure you know what you're getting into. But all of those tips and tricks, more detail on the pros and cons of each and examples of each, are available on the previous session. Sophie, my wonderful, I could call her co-host, but producer of the Financial Transformation Live, has popped the link already into the chat. She's well organized. So please do jump on to that one if you want to learn more about the pros and cons of those options. Now, so that kind of brings us to where we finished the previous session. And for those of you who have amazing memories, will remember I brought out this slide. So this is about how you build out your integration strategy between the different systems, okay? And I see strategy is very much sitting at a top level. So what we're going to do is work from that top level down to the depth and the detail, okay? So I'm going to talk you through the key steps you might want to think about and consider as you're going from the, I know I need to integrate, to how you get to the point where you're starting to say, this is exactly how the integration could and should work, and or actually going into implementation. So this is not about, we're going to talk about how we think about the integration, how we scope it out. And then, maybe even if we get lots of good feedback and you guys ask for it, we'll do a session on how to, implement an integration well. Okay. So let's talk about this. So there's a couple of key points, and I've put my suggested order. There are some times where I'll go out of this order, but firstly, I like to start off with an integration map. So I like to see the different systems. I like to understand the volumes that sit within each of those systems. So I can, very often I'll use it to prioritize. If I've got one system where there's a lot of transactions going through, I will of course prioritize that. The other thing you can do, though I haven't put it on mine, is you can put time. So if, because it could be that one integration, even though it's got less volume, actually takes up more time with your finance team or creates more problems. So you might want to put a number on that in terms of numbers of errors that come through or numbers of issues caused or the time it takes to manage those. We talk about how we map out data sets. And again, we're working our way down from, okay, between these two systems, what does that look like? Talking about data dependencies, talking about scenarios, talking about controls, field mapping, right? Again, we're very much getting in the detail, and then kind of key checks before you go away and start either building or finalizing pricing for your integration. Okay, so I'm going to pause for 2 seconds and just check. Anyone got any questions thus far? If there's something that you really want to get out of today's session, then please ask. Would love to know why you joined the session and if there was one particular area. And for those that are listening to this on demand, because, I know quite a few people live, but for those that are listening on demand, please don't be afraid to put comments either, because we will monitor those comments. I do get alerts when those comments come through as well. So it's well worth reaching out afterwards, and we will keep an eye on it post go live, because I know we get a lot of post go live listeners, which is lovely. Okay, so the first thing I like to do when I'm thinking about an integration is actually mapping out. So this is a typical Sage Intacct integration setup, right? So what do I mean by typical? So we've got obviously our Sage Intacct in the middle, and then we've got bi-directional syncs with, say, an expense platform. We might have a credit control platform. We might have our CRM platform, our Tapouty AP automation platform, and then an integration via the API. Now, at this stage, what I'm looking to understand is the fact that we have those integration, that is data being shared between those systems. I'll also start thinking about, well, what type of integrations? Remember those 4 categories of integrations that we talked about? I might at this point, talk about, like, we've got an expenses integration. I know that there's a pre-built integration between Intacct and web expenses. Is rather good as well. I have to say, well done to the web expenses team, that allows the two-way share of information. Again, the same with YayPay. There's a reason the modules I like working with, it's got a really nice two-way sync. So I'm starting to look at, right, so what data is shared between the systems. So the first thing I do is, okay, right, let's just get all of the systems that we want finance to integrate with, or that we are sharing data with, onto the screen. And let's map out volumes that are going through, what data sets. You'll notice I've got expenses and projects. So I share those. I might also, if it's web expenses, I'll also share probably items and maybe even suppliers across between those two. And then so I'll map out volumes, I'll map out the objects that are being shared. And then I'll also, if I'm looking to prioritize and only look at a couple of them, I will then look into like how much time does each of those integrations take from my finance team, so I can prioritize effectively, because we can't do everything at once. Okay, so once we've decided on the overall like architecture, we then need to look in more detail at the data sets. Okay, so moving on. So here's an example of what I will look. And again, you don't have to display it in this way. It's just one of the ways in which I display information. So what I will do is pull out each integration. I will basically pull out the objects in the terminology of the integration platform. So in this case, it's Salesforce and Intacct. And then I will then map in the object and the direction of travel. So as an example here, I know that Salesforce accounts create customers. Price books are a two-way sync, so that, it's managing that, the data's being shared in both directions. Same with products. Though, I might then decide, actually, I'm going to use one as the must. That's a different conversation. Projects and tasks, what creates what. And so I'll work through all of the common objects, and I want as many of the shared objects. So I would also, for instance, I wouldn't just have accounts, I would also have contacts as well. So any of the objects that are going to be shared should be in this list. And it's a really good way to do this. So some people like to go straight down to the detail. Personally, I like to just, layer the detail, because it allows for discussion. And at this stage, I'm thinking about, is there a source of the data? Is there one item that gets, do accounts get created in Salesforce, for instance, first? And which makes sense, right? Because the CRM guys are speaking to them. Like, we don't put them into the finance team until there's actually, a potential to need to generate a financial transaction or invoice, right? So we're starting to look at that top level as to, well, what objects are being shared and what is the direction of travel? And that very often will open up lots of conversations. Okay, so we're not getting into field mapping at this stage. We're just looking at that sort of top level to understand where are the commonalities. And also we're trying to understand the terminology, because, for instance, as you can see here, Sage Intacct calls Salesforce products items, right? So we're starting to get a shared terminology across the different systems. And particularly when you're working with developers that know one system a lot better than the other, this is a really useful guide. It will help them start to interpret any sort of API documentation, etc. So this is a really nice way to start. Okay, so you've built your, and we'll just go back. So you've built out your overall strategy. You've documented, and thought about volumes and what data is being shared. And then between each pair, you're really starting to share that information. And especially when you're looking at multi-integrations, then pulling all of those together and looking holistically. So for instance, if all of the modules use, say, customers, right? So making sure that the data flows works. If Salesforce creates the customers and then Intacct, making sure that Intacct then holds all of the financial information and that data is synced in both directions is important. Okay. All right. So deep breath. Any questions from anybody? It'd be interesting to see if anyone's actually gone through this process and has followed these steps. For me, I see a lot of this as common sense, but I think sometimes it's always common sense when you know what to do. So we'd love to hear your feedback. Any additional things that you have always made sure you've asked when you've done integration projects, hints and tips, always welcome for our audience. Okay. So the next thing, once we've understood the data mappings, what objects are we sharing between each system, we then need to think about data dependencies. Because, we might just, and this is again when you're almost post sense checking those data object maps. We're looking at, in order to push an invoice through, what data needs to exist and be correct before you can do it. So for instance, if you push through an invoice, if you're doing it Intacct, you need to have the product, or the item, if we're using Intacct terminology. Again, this is why it becomes quite good. The data maps always become a bit of a dictionary. So we've got the items, we've got customers. So customer has to exist before we can create an invoice, unless it's a one-off customer, different conversation. And we've also got to have things like dimensions. So if we're doing projects, it might be that the project has to exist. So again, understanding, in order to push transaction, each object, what data needs to exist for that object to be able to push through. Because the last thing you want to do is build out this integration and not have thought through the flow of information. Okay, so we're starting to think about data dependencies and where that data is coming from. And we've talked about masters. And what I mean by master, for those of you that haven't done an integration style project before, a master is kind of who is in charge of that record. Now, you can actually have shared masters whereby the customer, for instance, could have fields being updated in both systems. I see that a lot with customers and accounts. So they might have fields about industry, etc., being maintained by the sales team in CRM or the marketing team. But you will have obviously your financial fields like credit limits, etc., being maintained in your finance system. So thinking about master data sets, direction of travel, and understanding that direction of travel is really important when you're thinking about an integration. Okay, the next piece I then start to look at is what are the different scenarios that I might hit for different data sets. So we talked about customers earlier. So that could be, customers that buy on credit versus those that have to pay in advance. Okay, how does the integration process need to differ? So for instance, customers on credit, it might be that you have to call to the finance system to check the credit limit before you allow them to place an invoice or an order. So it's and again, you might say, actually, the way we deal with that is that we surface the credit limit in the CRM so that they can see it and they can get access to it and have that conversation as part of their, their due diligence call with the customer. So, all of these things have impacts on how you build the integration and, more importantly, what data you share between the two systems. Things like foreign currency come up a lot, where you're going to get exchange rate from. I find it a lot with different products. So say you've got different types of products or different lengths of contract. What does that mean? So I've seen quite a lot, I've worked with quite a lot of systems where they'll have professional services, contract, or invoicing and processes versus, things like subscription. And that data needs to be, and that process is very, very different. So picking apart all of those, and it's not just on the sales side. If we flip, and again, I want to keep this very broad across finance, you might have set, scenarios specifically around your AP, for instance. So common one is how do you process non-PO invoices? Do you need those to go through a different process? What does that mean for the integration? Now, you might go through your scenarios and go, it actually has no impact on the integration. And that's a great place to be. But I'm one of those pieces I like to, people that like to go through the detail when I'm designing an integration, because I don't want to get caught out later. And we'll talk about, as we get to the end of this process and we've gone through and asked ourselves all these great questions, wrapping back down to some of the pieces that you should have and check against, right? And again, I've got some resources I can share with you on those. And then you've got to think about controls. So we talked about the concept of a master data. So which record is in charge, perhaps, is one way to think about it. But if you are going to have multiple masters, well, what's your criteria for if something changes, right? And how often are you changing? So if you make a change to a record and you change a field on CRM, for instance, and then 5 minutes later, finance go in and change something on their side, Obviously, if you only sync overnight, for instance, then there's got to be a conversation about which record wins. Okay. So again, thinking about changes and scenarios and then feeding that into how often do you update records? Yeah, is really, really important. And that, are you going to batch? Are you going to do it in real time? And what is the definition of real time? Because I've seen everything from it needs to be in a minute to a real time is within the hour. Yeah. So I haven't had anyone that said that real time is within the day, but I'm sure there is somebody that might have that perception. So I've talked about changes to records, but alongside that, I would also add in how often things are being updated. And, you'll hear the term polling. So as in POLL, polling intervals and things like that. So that basically means how often do we go and check for changes in new data. The other thing as well is validation. So you need to think about what checks on data. So classic example is VAT and tax. So for instance, if a customer is a VATable customer, so can claim back the VAT, then you might need to hold their VAT ID, or you might need to have some proof that they are within a particular type. So what validations and checks do you need to do on the data before or after it passes from one system to the other? And the way to check this is and again, if you are doing integrations and you're doing it manually via Excel, think of all the things that trip you up when you do an import. And they're normally that's the minimum layer that you should have in your validation set. Obviously, you should be putting in a lot more because we want to anticipate, but it's a really good starting point. Things like authorizations. So I get this a lot with AP. So, as something comes through is, for instance, if there's a purchase invoice gets scanned in for an OCR, are you going to do authorizations on that in Intacct? Are you going to do it in your AP system? And I do apologize for those of you that aren't, I'm using Sage Intacct as an example, right? The same principles apply to every product, whether that's Sage 200, Sage 50, and a 0, whatever it is, whatever integration you're building, it does apply. Okay. I'm just using Intacct just because it's one of my specialties as a consultant that I work with. So, but the principles apply to all of them. And then thinking about checks, balances, and reconciliations, and the fact that the reconciliations check is a lot smaller is not because it's any less important. So thinking about, part of your month-end review should be, okay, what happens? How do we check that everything's come across? How do we make sure we're really confident? How do we reconcile the figures and the numbers across two different systems? Because you want to think about what are the checks and balances that you're going to have in place. Now, obviously, once the integration is up and running and it's, you've got through all of your testing, you've gone through a couple of months ago live, very often you will reduce the level of checks, balances, and reconciliations that you do. But in the interim, whilst you're going through both your UAT and your basic testing phase and your extended go live testing, you want to think about what are those checks, balances, and reconciliations that you need to do. And then last but not least is, thinking about how you're going to handle errors and issues with integrations. So for instance, what happens if it tries to push something across that doesn't sync for whatever reason? How, one, are you going to identify that error? 2, who gets alerted? And 3, what information do they need to troubleshoot that error and to fix it and get it pushed across? So thinking about what happens when it goes wrong. So your validations is kind of anticipating what could go wrong. Your errors and issues is thinking about what happens when it does go wrong, and how you're going to manage those processes. And I think this is an area that a lot of people don't think about when they build out integrations. They focus really well, very often about validations and do we have all the right information, but they don't think about how they're going to pull, how they're going to get a list of what hasn't synced and who needs to be alerted and who is going to fix it. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that that data is there? And this one, obviously, should be an ongoing feed. So I'm not talking about these being, just something you do at the beginning. Obviously, once you go through UAT, if you're hitting errors, they should feed back into validations. They should feed back into checks, balances, and reconciliations, okay? But I like to have like a starter for 10 when I'm building out an integration. And the more you get up front, the easier the UAT becomes. Okay. Again, guys, feel free to ask any questions. We're a quiet team today, quiet session, but feel free to jump in at any point. If anything doesn't make sense, or I'm using terminology that isn't familiar, or you've heard terminology and you want it explained, just pop it in the chat. It's genuinely no issue. And then once we've thought about those things, we're then getting into the detail, right? So I will, as generally, what you will find is you will start with scenarios, you'll work your way down to controls, and then you'll get to field mapping, and suddenly somebody will think of a scenario that the field mapping has mentioned, and then you go back up to the top. I like to do it this way because, all three, you should be checking against each other. Like each one will make you think differently about each of the others. Okay, so this is a bit of a loop that you go round, is like looking at the fields. Okay, how could that differ? Once you've got this field mapping as well, it's a lot easier, because when we're doing our field mapping, what we're looking at side by side is system 1, system 2, right? And for each object, those objects we mapped out earlier, again, you'll start to see the logic in the order that we're put together. For each object, you start to map out these fields. And then what we're looking at for each object is, right, what's the field name in that particular system? What's the format? And can you give me an example? Because can you see, for instance, a country, which is the third down on both sides, right? You can instantly see that they have a completely different drop-down set. One says UK, one says United Kingdom. Now, if you try to push that across, you're going to get a fail. Yeah. So what this field mapping allows you to do is to go through and really sit side by side those different field names and formats. The other thing as well is that what you should then be thinking about is looking at, for all the different scenarios that we looked at, how do these fields change? Is there any pieces that we need to think about? You should be obviously going back through and thinking about your validations, your controls, your errors. Where could I get errors? What errors could be created? Okay. So we're really going step by step through the different data sets and mapping them from, in terms of that. Now, if you're lucky, and I've put this as one of the resources, and I'll talk about this later, your providers will give you, object tables that you can look at that actually have the fields across. So I've definitely got one for 200, and I'm putting one together for Intacct. I think I've got one for 50 as well. From when I built like Power BI and analytical reports as well. Don't tend to need that as much as Intacct because it's all built in, but definitely for the 200 side. If you've got any questions around that side of things, then I might have some resources that you can ask for. So if you do, if you're using any of the Sage products, so Sage 50, Sage 200, Sage Intacct, you're thinking about integration and you would like some of the database maps that I'm putting together, if you could just comment yes in the chat, the Soph will keep an eye out, take a note of your name, and we'll reach out once it's ready. So I'm just finalizing the docs and getting them branded and stuff. So please do pop them in, put in a yes, or put in the one that you want, and we'll make sure that you get it. Okay. So once you've built out all those different elements, you've then, the next stage is to then go back and do another set of validation. Okay, so you kind of stay in that loop around scenarios, controls, fields, until you've gone around it so many times that you knew that you've covered everything. And then what you want to do is do some sense checking. Okay, because there's three main areas that you need to sense check. So the first thing is an example record. So we very much pulled when you put your field sets together, you're pulling a single example. I would then go back and look at lots of different examples for each of the different scenarios that we've pulled out, and say, right, how does that differ? Yeah, that matches, etc. Because again, what you're trying to do is preempt you having issues during testing. The more you get out now, the better your testing process is, because you get into more advanced testing versus, the basics like do these field match. The second thing is that I'm really hoping that if you've been attending these financial transformation live sessions, you're already well underway with your process mapping. So process maps are a really good way to sense check. Firstly, directions. So does the direction of travel in terms of what data gets created match what's on your process map? And if it doesn't, there's a few questions to be asked. Secondly, thinking about scenarios, does your data enable you to correct the pathway or to go down different pathways based on the scenarios you've got? And then the other thing, and again, I talk about process maps, but you could also follow the process through. So actually, follow a record through its journey. And if there's anything in terms of the process itself that could cause issues or you need to think about with integration. And again, the other thing I will say is that that's a great thing to do anyway. And if you're doing it and you haven't got a process map, just use it as a way to get a basic process map in place. I have done a couple of sessions on process mapping as part of these sessions. So if you haven't already attended one, I'm sure Soph will dig out the links to the process mapping ones. I've done at least 2 on them. But if there's any, but if you do want to give that a go, then I'd definitely suggest that, where I talk about things like tools, how to approach, best practice, all that kind of stuff. And then last but not least, and actually in my personal opinion, one of the most important things to do is to rationalize and review your data sets against your reporting requirements. So for instance, if you want to pull a P&L by industry in your finance system, you need to make sure that a customer has an industry. Yeah, because then you can use that Intacct anyway, you can use that to group your P&L and see per industry what it is. So again, you need to make sure that your integration data sets deliver the right data into each system to deliver on your reporting requirements. And if you have gaps, then now is a really good time to understand, well, where does that data sit now? Where do I need to get it into? And how do I get it in there? What integration needs to change? Okay, so this has been a really whistle-stop tour on integration, and I think made easy because I've not had a lot of questions. So I'm hoping everything I'm saying makes sense and is adding value. I know genuinely I would appreciate any feedback that you have on these sessions. It's always great to hear, what is working well, what is useful, and what people want, because obviously there's a bit of prep that goes into them. And you have to excuse the cold. One coming along soon. The joys of a British. I was going to say winter, but technically I think it's spring. So top tips for planning an integration strategy. So break the work into smaller, more manageable chunks. Okay, so I talked about starting at the top level and getting a top level overview. I like that because that gives me that bird's eye view at the top. But don't feel like you have to implement or do all of this for every single integration at once. It's idea. It's great to do it, but it's not essential. And actually, if you're going to do that, put it into chunks, get one chunk nailed rather than half doing lots of them, and work your way back. You can always go through a rationalization piece once you've designed it all. So if you are going to implement, make sure you break the work into smaller, more manageable chunks. Do not try and go live with every single integration at once, unless you have fully been through a full testing environment on each, and do not have UAT going on for every single integration if you can avoid it. Do really focus on scenarios. Most of the integrations that I see where there's challenges is because in scenarios haven't been thought about. There's a particular type of customer, particular type of billing, particular type of invoice, particular department that is more challenging than others. And everyone focuses on how does the process look, or how does the data look when everything goes well, and doesn't focus enough on the the controls, changes, etc. So a really classic example is purchase orders. I was literally having this conversation today with another customer. So they're looking to sync purchase orders between the different systems. And I said, well, at what point do you stop editing that purchase order? So, at what point do you finalize it? So once you've sent it out to the supplier, is that it? And the initial feeling was, well, yeah, of course it's it. And I'm like, well, what if something changes on that, or the order needs to change, or the courier comes back and says it's more expensive, the shipping, etc. How would you handle that? So thinking about what happens and the scenarios on which the data would change, and making sure that your data strategy, your integration strategy, reflects and gives you the ability to manage that change or identify those changes, because that's where discrepancies apply and it causes more problems. So in that way, what we say is the ideal scenario is to have a two-way sync, right? And the flag is that purchase order can be edited. We'll have to go back through an approval, but can be edited up until it's sent to the supplier, or up until the invoice is matched to it. Once that's happened, you can't edit it. So thinking about those checks, balances, controls, thinking about your scenarios is really, really important. And wherever possible, especially if you've got an already in system, always run it almost like not a testing phase, but like a phase by which you import data from system to system manually first, before you get your devs to start building, and assuming that obviously that you've got these data set, you've got exports for both systems. The reason I say it is that if it's a really good way to test data validation and to get ideas on where to validate, because it's a lot easier to quickly go through and go, right, this has fallen over on this, this, and this. Right, let's build those validations in, rather than having having to deal with validations on the fly when you're actually working with live data. Because there's a big difference between giving a developer like 5 example records and asking him to test and validate those, versus like thousands of records in a batch, and some of the, that have come from CRM, and there's all sorts of weird and wonderful data coming through. And of course, make sure that you have really good testing sheets and testing scenarios for once you've actually got that development built. Okay. And I think we might actually have an implementation session. I will cover some of these elements in the overall, thinking about your implementation project piece, but do think about building out test scenarios and examples and data sets, etc., for your testing, and make them as broad and as big as you can, and match material enough that you will identify enough issues before you go live. Okay, so before my throat goes and I run out of voice, so if you're looking at integration, my top tips are discuss integration before looking at a new system, right? Understand how they're going to integrate and what that integration capability is, and get into the detail, because a lot of people say we'll have an integration, and then you lift the hood, you get under the covers, and they're like, oh no, well, what we do is we give you an output file that's in the right format. And that, in my mind, is not a true integration. Well, it is, I guess it's the manual versus Excel, via Excel integration, but you need to know that going in. You need to understand the how, so not just what I said, which is the method of integration, but also what data, because very often people say, yeah, we've got an integration, but they'll only integrate, say, accounts, contacts, and invoices, and they won't integrate, say, products. So you have to be prepared to maintain those in both systems. And again, just thinking about it, think about how you're going to manage upgrades and changes to processes on both sides. Focus on systems that will give you flexibility and agility wherever possible, and or the ability to switch and to change things. That's always the best. And that's again why we like working with some of the pre-built connectors and the middleware, because it gives us a bit more flexibility. And make sure you have understood reporting requirements. I did that was one of 3, but in my mind, it's the big one, because that, let's be honest, that the reason we have finance systems is all about producing numbers to understand the business and how it's operating. And if you cannot get the reports out that you need, then we've got a problem. And actually the system loses a lot of value. So integration can add huge amounts of value in terms of time saved, but it can also add additional value in terms of the breadth and depth of data within each system. So it's a really great way to expand your reporting capabilities without, especially if you've got a really strong core system, without having to invest in like really fancy analytics software. Okay. So what we covered was a quick recap on options for integration. I talked through a couple of things to think about before you actually start building. And in fact, pretty much everything we covered today was all pre-built. These are conversations you should be having before you even start developing an integration. I showed you some examples of maps and, object maps and field sets and things you need to think about. And of course, you can ask as many questions as you like. And again, please do feel free to ask me, if there's something you didn't feel quite comfortable asking in the session, DM me afterwards. It may be we follow up with an FAQ. I genuinely do not mind. My email address is on the screen. And obviously you can DM me via LinkedIn, which is, I think, where most people would find me. And if you've got specific scenarios, again, it's a great, I'm always happy to look at it, and it might make topic for a great next Financial Transformation Live. So for the next session we're doing is actually all about top tips before starting your finance system implementation project. So today we talked about top tips for integration. We're going to go broader and talk about implementation. Oh, sorry, skipping ahead. And that one is on the 25th of April at 11 a.m. So please do sign up to it. We'll pop the link in the chat. So Sophie, if you wouldn't mind doing that, please do go in and sign yourself up. For those that want to get, if you do sign up to it, you will actually be able to watch it after the fact as well. And if you want to get automatic alerts, without having to attend and see the next session, then you can actually sign up on our website to receive alerts on the next FTL Live on our main page. And again, I'm sure Soph will pop that link into the chat as well for those that want it. So resources, I always like to have some resources. So for those that are looking at integration, if you haven't already, please do watch my Integrating Your Finances session. It's a great intro to why integrate and the types of integration. If you are using Sage or thinking about using Sage and would like a Sage database guide, I'm putting them together as we speak for 50 Intacct and 200. So if you want to put, either say yes in the chat, DM me or DM Sophie, I'm sure she won't mind. We will happily put you on the wait list. As soon as it's ready, you'll get a copy into your inbox. If you are looking at, if you want to integrate, but perhaps your finance systems aren't built for it, maybe you're on a Sage 50 and you want to do lots of integration and connections, then come and have a conversation and maybe have a look at Sage Intacct. It's designed to integrate. It's got a really brilliant API. In fact, it's one of the best I've worked with. So, we've got a webinar. If you want to just, have a nosy, see what it's all about, then please do dial on. If you want to have a conversation, obviously, I'm here. If you want to have a chat, I love working with Intacct. It's one of my favorite products to work with. And then, I hope this has been useful. So thanks again for joining. I apologize for the sore throat and stuffy nose, but hopefully what I've said has been clear. Hope it's been useful. And if you have any thoughts, comments, feedback, genuinely would love to hear it. Always like to know if this stuff is useful, because if not, we'll change it, we'll make it different, and we will, tweak the content to make sure that we're hitting the needs of our audience. So thanks again for joining. Hope you're all well, and I'll see you next time on Financial Transformation Live.